All right, welcome back to the next episode of my NHL Team Deep Dive series, and today we're talking about the Montreal Canadiens, and really a season of hoping for progression, I guess, is the name of the game here in Montreal. They feel like a lot of the pieces are already there, especially on the back end, and obviously with the pick of Ivan Demidov this year, who I'm not necessarily going to talk about in this video because he's not going to play this year, but that hopefully will solve a lot of their high-end offensive problems. Montreal really didn't do a whole lot this offseason, or at least yet. I still think there's potential for a move. I still think they might have to move another defenseman out. But overall, like, this team feels like they're pretty okay with just rolling into next season, essentially with the team they had going into last season. And I guess that's a good way to jump quickly into the offseason moves for this team. And Alex Boulet, the only forward they bring in, just basically a depth forward. And they only lose two depth forwards in Tanner Pearson and Jesse Ulenin. This forward core is the same. I don't know how to... like, they get no change, even though three players swap teams. It just isn't significant enough to really make much of a dent in their offensive core. It's the same team, right? Like, I mean, Tanner Pearson, I guess, is the biggest name, but he really wasn't playing full-time, and he wasn't going to play full-time this year anyway. And Ulenin was a nice depth piece, but that's all he is, and Pierre Brulé will basically fill that spot as like a fringe NHLer, probably spent a lot of time in Laval. It's the same offense. They get no change there. Defensively, they don't really add anybody. They lose Jonathan Kovacevic, who I really like, actually. And we'll talk about him eventually in more detail. But I really like Jonathan Kovacevic. I think he's a very good, like, bottom pair defenseman. He fills that role, like, perfectly. He's kind of my, like, the defenseman I would love to have as a third pair defenseman. Very reliable. Not going to play a ton of minutes, but isn't really going to make a ton of mistakes, not screw a lot of things up. I get why they had to move him. They probably have to move another defenseman still, but yeah, I like him, so it's slightly downgraded for me just based on that. Obviously, they're going to fill the holes with, hopefully, I mean, probably, I'd assume it's going to be either Hudson or Reinbacher, maybe both. And both are going to get a shot at camp, but as of now, they're just prospects. So on paper, based on my model, they did downgrade because I'm not sold on either of those guys, fully being able to step in because we just haven't seen it yet. So that's just the way it works. They get slightly downgraded there, but I mean, I get why they had to do it. And in net, they didn't make any changes. So, like I said, it's basically the same team that they're running back. I mean, Kovacevic is the biggest name they lost this offseason, and he's a third pair defenseman, right? So there's really not a big dent in the team, and they seem to be okay with that. So that's kind of what we're going with. So yeah, that's the Canadiens offseason. I think this is probably the least exciting offseason, at least in terms of roster moves this year. I think that's fair. Obviously, I mean, Ivan Demidov's a huge addition, but he'll be added next season. For Canadiens fans' sake, you hope he'll be added next season anyway. But as for this year, like, that's it. So kind of a slow offseason for the Canadiens. I think they're okay with that. So jumping into this forward core, they ranked 29th in my grading. And before I jump into the big ones, Raphael Harvey-Pinard obviously is out for 4 months. I still have him on here because he's a C- and I really like him. But, I mean, Joshua Roy probably fills that slot. There's a couple other guys in Laval that are going to come up, but Joshua Roy is kind of the big one that isn't on this roster currently because he wasn't on Daily Faceoff's roster and I made the graphic, and then the injury thing happened, and I wasn't going to completely make a new graphic for Raphael Harvey-Pinard. I'm sorry. He's really good. I like him. Joshua Roy is going to have a shot at making this team anyway, but he would have just been a P. This team would have been ranked the same anyway. It doesn't matter. Don't fight me. That's the explanation. There you go. Wanted to get that out of the way. Let's dive into the big pieces on this team. Start with Nick Suzuki, who, honestly, an A- when I was grading everybody, I was surprised they gave Nick Suzuki an A- because I've been harsh on Nick Suzuki not really being a true first-line center. But the last 2 years, like, he's really stepped into that role. I mean, he's been the leader for this team, obviously on the ice with the C, but also in terms of like offensive production. Like, he's been the guy driving this top line. He's been the one being a big player on the power play, and he's even become a lot better defensively. And that was something I didn't really see coming, because a lot of people, especially after the Cup run, really overrated his defensive ability in that playoff run because he wasn't getting the primary, like the hardest matchups, right? Like, those were going to Philip Deneau, who was fantastic at it. But over the last couple of years, like, Suzuki, I mean, he hasn't been like Selke level defensively, like some Canadiens fans seem to think, but he's been fine. Like, as for what he is, like, he's been a solid defender. And I think that's all you can really ask for, is him just being like above league average. And he's been better than that. But like, that's kind of what I expected from him at this point, and he's exceeded that, so I'll give him credit for that. But I mean, offensively too, like, he's been a very good play driver. He's been able to put up the points as well, even when his wingers really aren't matching those point totals in the way that you probably would have hoped. But yeah, he's been really good. So A- was surprising to me too, especially because of how, I don't want to say negative I've been on him, but as critical as I've been on Nick Suzuki over the last year and a half. And even, I mean, critical might be a harsh word, because like, I think he's still very good. But yeah, the A- kind of surprised me. So good on Nick Suzuki. He when I really dove deeper into this team, he was I was shocked that I graded him as high as I did, and I think he deserved it. Cole Caulfield's another interesting one, because obviously the goal production that everybody, or at least that some Canadiens fans seem to think that he should be at, hasn't quite been there yet. He's had a couple injury issues, but he's still been a very good offensive producer as well. I mean, his play driving metrics have been good. His offensive zone capabilities have been well documented. Obviously, defensively, he is what he is, but he's even there. Like, he's not like Patrick Kane bad. Like, he's been fine. He's been what I expected him to be defensively, and that's fine. But yeah, I think obviously the goals are kind of the big thing. That's the main selling point with Cole Caulfield. He needs to get there still, and there's time. Like, I'm not worried about him yet, but I think, yeah, like, this is kind of going to be a big year if he can stay healthy, if he can play close to 82 games, and maybe get to that 35, 40 goal mark, right? Like, is that pushing it? Like, that's got to be kind of the hope, right? Like, that you hope he can get to 40, but we'll see. I mean, he's going to obviously have a much more stable line. That's something he hasn't really had yet. Obviously, they had it the back half of last season, but now you fully know that, like, this is the first line for the Montreal Canadiens going into this season, and I feel like they really haven't had that solidified in the same way yet since Caulfield's been there. So now he like knows he obviously had Suzuki pretty well his whole time there, but they know who that other winger is. So that's good. Speaking of the other winger, it's Yuri Slafkovsky, and again, this is somebody I've been extremely critical of pretty much from the jump, and he had a very, very good second half of the season, right? Like, everybody, that's been well documented. Like, it was very good. The issue I have, right? And obviously, I don't want to preface this by saying I'm not saying these are the same type of players. I'm not saying they're the same caliber of players. I think Yuri Slafkovsky is significantly better than the example I'm about to throw out, but I think it's important to make this distinction. The numbers that Nick Suzuki and Cole Caulfield put up with Yuri Slafkovsky in the second half of last year were very similar, obviously in a much smaller sample size, to the numbers they put up when they were playing with Raphael Harvey-Pinard when he had that like crazy point-a-game streak for like last 15, 20 games of the season a year or two ago. And obviously Slafkovsky is a better player, right? I'm not saying that he's Raphael Harvey-Pinard, but I'm saying that the catalyst for this line are Nick Suzuki and Cole Caulfield. And they have to play with a certain player archetype on their wing to make it work the most effectively. And clearly it has, right? And I think getting a more skilled player like Slafkovsky has obviously elevated them to a higher level than that. But underlying lies, like the two catalysts for this line truly are Suzuki and to a lesser extent Cole Caulfield. I think the pieces are here, at least in that top three. I think they all progressed very well last season. They progressed very well the season before that as well. Martin St. Louis has done a great job building these young players up, both on the offensive side and later on the defensive side we'll talk about. I think he's done fantastic, giving them the freedom to just go out there and learn. He's not trying to shelter them at all. He's just, here's like, you're going to learn from experience, basically, and he's done a fantastic job with that. I expect all three of these guys to improve. I don't know if I expect necessarily to see somebody like Suzuki move into like the A tier by the end of next year, but I think he'd move up. If I were to rank everybody in the A- tier, I think he'd move up in that tier. Same with Cole Caulfield. I don't know if I necessarily see him moving up a whole tier, but again, I think he gets better. Slavkovsky is somebody I could see jumping up to a B at the end of the season. Just to kind of give you an idea for where I think this team ends up. But I think we continue to see progression from these guys, and that's kind of their three safest guys, I think, at this point. And I don't know if I would have said that about Slavkovsky going into last season. But I think the progression we saw with him in those 50-ish games on the top line were very productive. And I think that continues, right? Like, I think giving him a stable line combination is good. And that's going to be healthy for him. And we're going to see him become even better. I think that's where the really good news for this offense ends. Alex Newhook is fine. I didn't love the trade at the time. I still don't love the trade now. I think that the Canadiens overpaid for Alex Newhook. He's not. I don't see him becoming like a full-time top six forward, especially if this team's going to want to compete, right? Like, he's somebody who should be on your third line as like the second best player on your third line as a cup team. So it was an interesting move. Brandon Gallagher's there. Josh Anderson's here. Raphael Harvey-Pinard, I already talked about. I like him, but again, fourth liner, right? Ideally. I quickly, before I touch on the centers, I kind of want to talk about Joel Armia a little bit, because I love Joel Armia. He's overpaid, and I think Canadiens fans and the rest of the league underrate him because he's overpaid. But like, Joel Armia was one of the best penalty killers in the NHL last year, if not like the best penalty killer in the NHL. Like, he was incredible, and people just kind of overlooked that. And I think if you get the chance, I mean, go watch Joel Armia on the penalty kill. If you like strong defensive play, that's kind of the benchmark for it. Like, he was incredible. Like, he would yeah, even defensively 5-on-5. Like, he was great. He had a great season last season. And you had the offensive numbers too, right? Like, yeah, he's overpaid, but he's still a super useful player. And I really hope that somebody recognizes that, either like before this contract ends, and they make an offer to Montreal. Like, the Canadiens probably retain 50%, and go get him into a cup run, man. Because this is a guy that, throw him on a playoff roster and people are gonna fall in love with him, right? Like, it'll be like Matthias Janmark in Edmonton this year, where people just absolutely fell in love with him at the end of the year because he was like that gritty third liner, bottom six guy. Played in all the hard minutes and put up, scored some big goals, played some big minutes, right? Like, we saw it in 2021, right? Like, Armia was part of that fourth line in Montreal with Perry and Eric Stahl, and they were fantastic. So I really hope somebody gives them the opportunity to play some meaningful hockey. Obviously, Canadiens fans should be happy they have him. I think he's a great kind of vet to have in that bottom six, teaching a lot of those guys how to play those hard minutes, in quotations. But I really need to see this guy back in the playoffs because he's just so much fun. As somebody who just loves watching these underrated, like, bottom six guys who nobody talks about, I could go on about Joel Armia forever. But my biggest concern with this offense specifically isn't necessarily all the veterans, sprinkled out through the bottom nine of this roster, really, but it's the center core, right? Like, Kirby Dach, theoretically, could be great. right? Theoretically, if he can play more than 10 games a season. Christian Dvorak's kind of a lost cause as a top 6 forward at this point. And Jake Evans is fine as your 4th line center. But my biggest thing, and I still believe this, even though I think Nick Suzuki has taken massive steps, this team needs to find a solid second line center. Ivan Demidov's played center a little bit. I don't think he plays center in the NHL, at least not in a full-time, like, second line basis. If that's the plan, I'd question the plan, right? Like, if Ivan Demidov can come in and be a center in the NHL, then that's great, right? And that's like, it's like an extra, it's like a cherry on top of the sundae, right? It's like, that's awesome. But that shouldn't be the plan, right? That's like a finding $20 on the ground when you're walking home from school. This team needs to find a true second line center. I don't trust Kirby Dach to be that guy. I think if he's healthy and he can play 82 games a season or close to it, he might be able to develop into that. But even then, I think that's a weak center core, because I think Nick Suzuki is still on that low end of true first line centers. And you have a really weak second line center in Kirby Dach behind that, even at full health. This team really needs to figure that out. That's why, again, I think Martin Nikas would have been a really nice piece for this team and kind of fits their timeline. Obviously, he's a little old, but he fits this timeline decently well. Didn't work out. That's fine. But I still think that's a glaring issue on this team, and it's been a glaring issue since they traded for Kirby Dach, basically. And I don't think, basically since they left Philip Denogo, right? Like, that second line center slot's been kind of a black hole for this team. And they didn't really address it this summer, and that was my biggest negative for this offense. But other than that, I think the top line is fine. Do not touch it. Let them go. Let them keep progressing. Ivan Demidov is going to come in. He's going to solve a lot of those problems. He's going to give you your high-end, like, point-producing elite forward, which this team lacks right now. And you just kind of have to figure out that second-line center spot. And then I think, like, the core is good, at least in the top half of this roster, right? Because you'll have Joshua Roy in the bottom 6. I don't think he's a true second-line forward. I think he'll be a very good third-liner. You hope some of your other young picks can kind of step up and move into that bottom 6 area. But again, I don't know if I see a ton of, like, huge top 6, like, game-breaking potential in anybody else in their forward prospect group other than Ivan Demidov. So I think that's kind of the biggest concern for me with the Canadiens. But other than that, like, it's going to be another rebuilding year. Obviously, they're going to have another top 8-9 pick, and they're going to be okay with that because this is another pretty decent draft class. But that's the forward core. Jumping into the blue line, I believe it was the San Jose video. It was one of them that I talked about how there was a team who was ranked 31st, who I believe could take a massive leap defensively. That was Montreal. And I think you kind of have to start the discussion here with the young guys. And that's how I have them highlighted here. Caden Gooley has really been thrown under the fire as a the top line defenseman on this team for the last couple of years. And he's basically been able to tackle every one of those challenges pretty effectively. I still have him at a B- because he hasn't, like, exceeded those expectations yet, but he's been able to survive at a decent level with the roles that he's been handed. And I think that's as much as you could expect from him at this point based on the circumstances. So I'm happy with where he is right now. The other player that's going to be interesting to watch is Lane Hudson, who I'm not even convinced should play full-time, at least at the start of the season in Montreal. I wouldn't be opposed to at least starting the year with both Hudson and David Reinbacher in Laval. And based on the fact that Justin Barron and Jordan Struble are still in on this roster, that might be the plan. And I don't hate it, because, like, why not load up Laval and try to go on some crazy run? right? Like, I don't, like, Montreal isn't in a position right now. This isn't like a San Jose where they don't have NHL bodies to play, right? Like, and not that, like, San Jose should sit Celebrini and Will Smith anyway, but, like, a lot of Montreal's guys that would be coming up this year aren't playing at the higher point of the roster, right? Like, they're not throwing in a Demidov this season, right? Like, you're talking about, I mean, Joshua Roy's going to get a shot out of camp, especially with the RHP injury, but, like, guys like Lane Hudson, they're going to play on the power play, but you still have Matheson there who's going to run the first unit. You know, like, Reinbacher is going to get a look. Logan Mailloux is going to get a look. But, like, you're going to run out of room. And why not just have all three of those guys play down? You can run Justin Barron in that Lane Hudson spot that I have on here, and you can have Struble as your seventh defenseman and just rotate him in and out of the lineup like you did last year. Right? At least to start. Obviously, if Lane Hudson comes into camp and looks like a top 4 defenseman in the NHL, then, like, play him. Same with David Reinbacher. But, like, I'm not opposed to them just giving those guys a year in Laval to really hone in, play super meaningful hockey all year, and try to go on a playoff run. I don't hate that. And I think Canadiens fans are going to be maybe not, like, super accepting of that, because obviously they want to see all these young talented players that people have been talking about for the last couple of years, like, play. But I also don't think long term that's necessarily a bad option. Now, I don't think playing them is a bad option either, but by the end of the season, like, in the dog days of the season when you're not playing meaningful hockey, that can be very difficult for a young player who's going to get frustrated. It can, we've seen it deteriorate players before. I'm not saying it happens to everybody, but it is a real part of sports, right? I don't hate the idea of playing them, giving them opportunities to play huge minutes in Laval. We'll see. The other guy on this blue line is Michael Matheson, who I have been saying they should be moving, or at least trying to shop off. He's very much a power play specialist. If you actually look at his point splits, a significant number of them are on the power play, and his underlying numbers offensively, or 5-on-5, aren't great. I still think he's the best defenseman on this team, but, like, it's not, he doesn't fill a need that this team doesn't have coming up, right? Like, if the idea is to play Lane Hudson this season, he's going to have to play significant time on the power play. If Lane Hudson can step into that, then Michael Matheson becomes incredibly expendable. So, and obviously Logan Mailloux has that offensive power too, and can be your second power play guy, right? Like, they have these guys here already. I think Matheson is kind of the odd man out here. David Savard's obviously here too. He won't be probably by the end of the season, I'd assume. And then, like, Arbor Jacki is a super complicated player. I don't think anybody properly rates him. You either have people who absolutely hate him and say he shouldn't be in the NHL at all, and you have some people who think that he's, like, the second most valuable player on this team and shouldn't be traded at all and should never be in conversations for anybody. And if the Oilers offered Connor McDavid from 1-for-1, we wouldn't take it because Arbor Jacki is a unicorn and he's great. And he's a third pair defenseman. He's a fine third pair defenseman. That's who Arbor Jacki is. He can come in out of your lineup. He's not gonna, like, ruin your season. He's fine, right? Jordan Harris kind of in that same boat. He's solid. I like Jordan Harris. He's the third pair defenseman too. Right? This blue line's interesting. They're super young. I hope they stay super young. Keep playing the kids. It's gonna get better. Thumbs up. It's the second worst blue line in the league going into the season. I don't think it's going to be there by the end of the year. Finally, moving on to the, like, best unit on this team by a pretty significant margin. And this is really the unit that has boosted them above these other teams, really, because, like, 29 and 31st in forward and defense, we've seen teams who are significantly better than that so far in this series. But it's the goaltending for this team that I think is really the bright spot and really the part that nobody's talking about with Montreal. And they're tied for 18th with a number of teams. And it's Sam Montembeault and Caden Primo. And I think Montembeault is the more interesting one. But Caden Primo has really he kind of was in that trifecta with him, Monty, and Allen during the season. And then obviously Jake Allen got traded, and Caden Primo had to step up and be kind of the full-time backup for the rest of the season. And he looked comfortable as an NHL goalie for the most part, right? Like, I don't think there was any glaring thing that really stood out to me that said he needs to continue to be in the AHL. This was really the Caden Primo's an NHL level goaltender. He should be here full-time. Give him the backup spot this year and see what he can do with it, right? Give him a bit more of a leash. He'll play 30, 35 games, maybe even 40. Let him see what he can do, right? Like, pretty well split, have a tandem going with him and Montembeault and see what happens. That's fine. C-, solid backup, no complaints. Sam Montembeault is really the interesting one because this is a guy who a couple years ago was on waivers. And even when they re-signed him, like, a lot of people didn't understand it. They didn't get it. But over the last 2 seasons, Samuel Montembeault has had the 14th hardest workload in the NHL based on expected goals against. As in, he's faced the 14th most expected goals against for any goalie in the last 2 seasons. He's 7th in goals saved above expected in the last 2 years. He's 7th. I want to say that again. Sam Montembeault is 7th in goals saved above expected over the last 2 seasons. Here are the names of the goalies that are above him. Connor Hellebuck, who everybody considers to be one of the best to be the best, if not like the second best goalie in the NHL. Linus Ullmark, who's number 2, who again, one of Vezina. Ilya Sorokin, again in that conversation for best goalie in the league. UC Saros, same thing. Igor Shesterkin, and Jeremy Swayman. That's the list. Sam Montembeault is 7th. When are we going to have a conversation with this guy being like a legitimate starter in the NHL? Like, he's a B+. I've no issue with that. I think he rocks. Right? Like, that's very good. Like, those 7 goalies ahead of him, nobody's going to argue with you aren't top-end NHL goalies. Right? The issue is with Montembeault, and the reason why a lot of people seem to have issue with him is because his save percentage and goals against average are low. Guess what? He has the 14th hardest workload in the NHL, and he's playing in front of a defense that is going to allow a ton of chances, and an offense that really can't handle it either. He's going to allow more goals than those guys playing for top-end teams. He's going to save less shots than those teams because his shots are harder. That's just kind of the reality of it, right? Like, there's a bit of context that needs to be provided there as well. But, like, man, goalies are weird. I get it. He could come out this year and be the worst goal in the NHL, right? He can pull, like, it's absolutely possible. But as of now, like, I'd be very confident with Montembeault as the starter in Montreal right now, and like feeling good about that, especially if Caden Primo can keep progressing. But yeah, that's the Canadiens. A super fascinating team, despite the fact that their offseason was pretty non-existent, really, outside of their first round of the draft. But yeah, like, I'm excited for this team. This is one of the teams I'm excited to watch this year. I think there's a huge potential for progression with the Canadiens. I don't know if that I don't think that progression means like fighting for a playoff spot. I don't think they're close to that yet. But I think progression, the fact that they're young kids, especially on this blue line, I think we'd see a huge step from the Canadiens blue line this year, especially if Reinbacher and Hudson both get full-time NHL opportunities. This team could be really fun. And I also kind of want to take a minute here to point out that this is the end of my these teams shouldn't care about winning this year tier of my list. Like, the gap between Montreal and my next best team is significant. There's a pretty sizable point jump between like the rest of these teams and the next tier, which are all very close. So you can consider this like the end of part 1 of this series, because these are the teams that shouldn't care about winning. They're fighting for, like, they're worried about the top end of the NHL draft, just kind of letting the kids progress. Now we're kind of moving into these guys are fighting for playoff spots. on the outside first, and then we move into the teams that are more likely to get in. But this is kind of the end of the rebuild, the true rebuilding teams. So take that as you will. But anyway, thank you for watching. Let me know what you think of the Canadiens. I'm hoping this video does really well because Montreal is a super popular team, and we'll see what happens. But I think the conversation's gonna be pretty lively for this one. So I'm excited to kind of see everybody else's opinion on them. And yeah, let me know what you think of Montreal this year and where their direction go. I guess the biggest question would be, what should they do with Hudson and Reinbacher? I'm not opposed to them playing in Laval. Obviously, if they play great, put them in the lineup. But anyway, let me know what you guys think. See you guys in the next one. Make sure you like and subscribe, and next video should be out fairly soon.